A little while ago, I was shown this insurance commercial ad where there was supposedly knitting involved, although everything that they were working on and showing off as final projects was actually crocheting, and that got me thinking how much real knitting is happening in TV and movies. Didn't think much more of it until I was served up a new water ad which featured Zendaya knitting a kind of cozy for her water bottle, which ended up being crochet and not knit. Which leads us to today. I'm going to react to some knitting, or maybe knitting scenes in TV and movies. Welcome to Engineering Knits. I love anything to do with fiber crafts, whether it be modern, vintage, or historical. I especially love the historic stuff, so if you enjoy anything like that, please feel free to subscribe, and let's get right into reacting to some of these scenes that some of you all recommended I watch.
You just sit down with the rest of the girls and I'll be glad to show.
I love this whole group of women sitting together at the table and knitting. It really reminds me of some knitting groups that I'm a part of.
You take the needle and stick it so into the stitch, you see?
I'm not paying attention to the main focus of the action right now, but more the hands that are in the periphery of the video. And I'm just trying to see the different styles of knitting that we can see. I think these hands up here are doing Continental knitting, if I'm not mistaken, which is the style of knitting that I typically do, versus the other ones seem to be doing more of the throwing or English method. I just find it fascinating to see the different styles represented. Oh, I think I was mistaken. I think all of them are doing the English style. And one of the ways that I can tell is throwing style, you're moving the yarn rather than the needles. And a lot of times you're holding your yarn in your right hand versus Continental, you're holding it in your left. And now that the image is more clear, it looks like everyone that I can see so far is all doing English style.
That's the boy, yes. And throw the yarn over in front.
That face is the face that I often make when I'm learning some of my new crafts here on the channel. So I think I looked like that a lot when I was learning tatting from a Victorian book. So I relate a lot to that. And I love that you can also see that she's teaching him the throwing or English style of knitting where you're moving the yarn around the needles. The other thing that I really enjoy about this clip is that you're seeing a little bit more gender diversity in the knitting here. I'm glad to see a little bit more of that male representation in knitting, and I want to see more of the diverse representation in the knitting. One of the things that really stood out to me is that while we do have more men representation in a lot of these clips, I tried really hard, and maybe I can get some suggestions from you all, but it was difficult for me to find representation of people of color knitting in TV or movies. So I think that that's still missing, at least from a search that I could do. So any suggestions, I would love to see more of that. The next one we have to look at is the knitting from Miss Marple. There's a few different versions, so I just chose one of them to try to focus on the knitting scenes in those. So in this first scene, it looks like Miss Marple is knitting with some yellow yarn, and it looks like she's referencing a knitting pattern that's on her lap, which makes me think that she is in fact really knitting this. I did have to watch a lot of this in order to pick out just the knitting scenes from this particular adaptations, and I was so fascinated by this because I truly believe that the person who is playing Miss Marple is in fact knitting in real time, because as the scenes go on and as the show goes on, you can see her working through longer bits of the yellow project, and then when she's done with the yellow project, she has someone helping her wind up the pink skein into new balls to knit, and then when she's done with the pink project, she picks up a blue one. So I just kind of love that continuity, and I love the realism of working through and like progressing through projects over time. Although if it were me, I would probably have like multiple projects going on at the same time. I'm not very good about not picking up new projects until the one I'm currently working on is finished. The other thing that stuck out to me was the style in which she knits. Her right needle in particular is pointing upwards. She does knit in English style, so she's holding the yarn over her right hand and she's throwing the yarn, but the yarns kind of point in an upward, almost bunny ear direction, although the one in her left hand does hang down a little bit more. I did see a few comments where people were saying, especially in animations, it seems strange because a lot of times the knitting needles were pointing upwards in a V shape. I think that is meant to portray Miss Marple's style of knitting, and that is called parlor knitting. It became fashionable in the Victorian era. This is based on a history of hand knitting, one of the reference books that I have in my collection. Basically, it was meant to make your hands look more dainty as you were knitting. So it's knitting for the parlor, for when other people are supposed to be watching you. And that's maybe where that like depiction of the upwards pointing needles came from, because your needles do point a little bit more upwards when you're holding your hand. It's almost like you're holding your needle like a pencil. so it sticks up. Speaking of depictions of knitting, or like illustrations of knitting, now we're gonna look at the Looney Tunes grandma knitting.
You'll never find me in here.
That knitting box, I have seen that in antique stores and I want one so badly for my own knitting supplies, but they've been pretty pricey, the ones that I have found, and I also probably do not have any more room for any more knitting knickknacks. See, this is exactly what I mean. With the way that she's knitting, or it's depicted that she's knitting, her needles are like bunny ears. They're in like the pointed shape, and with the way that she's dressed, she probably is supposed to depict a Victorian style grandmother. So she probably learned the parlor style knitting. I mean, the knitting movements are very like roughly animated, but you do see yarn flying, which I would then assume to mean that they're trying to depict something like English style knitting. And I also love how like the yarn itself is color changing. So rather than her having multiple strands or balls of yarns in the different colors to make that argyle pattern, the yarn is perfectly striped to make up that pattern, which does exist now and also existed back then. I did find some advertisements for things like that, so it could have been the case. And of course the piece unravels from the wrong end, so unless you have like a provisional cast on, that's not possible, but we're in make-believe land, so it's absolutely fine. I liked that one. That one was very cute.
Perhaps we should let him try it sometime. Might be fascinating.
So Morticia Addams here is actually knitting. She's once again knitting in the English style. I don't know exactly what she's knitting, but sometimes in later seasons or later episodes or other adaptations, you can see that Morticia holds up something that's either got like a super long neck or like 3 legs, you know, to fit in with the Addams family. I love that. So the actress does actually know how to knit, and she is knitting correctly in the scene, which, by the way, it brings up the point for me when I was talking about the commercial that Zendaya was in with the water. To me, it looked like when I watched the commercial for the first time that Zendaya knew the correct movements that were needed in order to knit. However, she was focusing so much on delivering her lines and performing in the scene that it was difficult for her to maybe finish them. So even though, you know, you pull out a crochet thing at the end, even though Zendaya's knitting in the beginning, it did seem to me like she knew she was knitting. So I looked into it more, and it turns out Zendaya does know how to knit. It's not easy to knit and talk and perform and do multiple things at once. So I do not blame her for having maybe slightly messy knitting in that scene, but you could tell from the movements that she kind of understood what it meant to knit. If you ever want to watch a show that has beautiful knit, especially hand knit items showcased throughout the show, especially if you're into vintage knitting, I would 100% recommend Call the Midwife. It's a fantastic show as it is, but just having those glimpses of those beautiful sweaters and tea cozies, blankets, baby knits just makes it that much better. It's going to feature some scenes with knitting or crocheting in it, and to be honest, when I saw this the first time, it irked me a little bit, because for a show that is so good with the pieces that it has, I got a little frustrated that they got this a little bit wrong.
So she'll never knit enough to make a whole blanket and realise it's all...
See, that bit right there. So they have on their laps crocheted granny squares for a larger blanket, but what they're working on in their hands are squares of knitting. And there's nothing that says that you can't mix crochet and knitting or whatever you want in a blanket that you are making. It doesn't matter. However, at the end scene where they are finishing off this blanket and they're sewing together all the different pieces, they're all crochet. So the knitting, I'm not exactly sure what they did with those squares of knitting. It's possible that neither of the actresses knew how to crochet, or maybe they knew how to crochet, but doing a granny square, for me at least, requires more concentration than just straight knitting. So again, this is like probably a case of either the skills weren't there or not good enough, or it's like a little bit too tough to do both the fiber craft and the acting at the same time. I mean, at the end of the day, does it really matter? Is it that big of a deal? No. I just think it's fascinating to take a little bit closer look at something, especially when it's something that you're so interested and invested in, that you can physically understand a little bit more detail about what these actresses are doing within a movie that you're watching or a show. And just to note, both of the actresses do look like they know exactly how to knit and what they're doing, and they're both knitting, once again, English style, which I would expect for a show that's from the UK. The next one is probably my absolute favorite. I love the show Wallace and Gromit, and rewatching it now with the lens of watching out for the knitting makes my heart so happy. I didn't realize how good the animated knitting is in this. Okay, so it looks to me like Gromit is knitting in the English style. He's holding his yarn in his right hand, and although he's not physically moving his hand very far, usually that's a sign of knitting English styles if you're holding it in your right hand, or paw in this case. I also love the texture of the wool in this, and although whatever he's working on isn't growing in size, it's not the only time Gromit knits in the shows, and I did find another instance where he's knitting. What I love about this one is I feel like you can see the flicking motion a little bit better on his right hand with his paws, so a little bit more of that English style knitting. And then that little bit there at the end where he's using his pinky to pull a little bit more of the yarn from the ball, all of it is just, you see it, and as a knitter you really recognize it and you resonate with it. Just those little tiny details just make your heart happy when you see it. So I think so far we have watched all scenes where people truly do understand knitting and they know how to knit. This next one I think it's a fun one to look at. At least it made me smile. I love that instead of trying to depict the act of knitting, they decided to have him take an already perfectly fine wound ball of yarn and unwind it haphazardly onto his arm. I mean, probably an easier thing to do than to like mash needles together and probably have the stitches fall off and make it very obvious that he's not actually knitting. But just like if you understand what's happening, he's doing so many things that are just the complete opposite of trying to knit something. You're just actively undoing progress.
Listen, I'm sorry about last night. Sure, I made this for you.
The other thing I love about this is that first you see him actively undoing a ball of yarn that he could knit from, but it just seems like the evening has passed and the next morning he has fully finished this beautiful sweater, which, I mean, it's not impossible. I personally have kind of successfully knit a sweater in a day, but it's not easy. Although I guess if you were programmed in the way that he is, maybe you can knit lightning fast, although I would have liked to see that in the movie instead of the unwinding of the yarn ball. Another one that comes up often for me is the enchanted knitting needles in Harry Potter. Let's rewatch it with a lens of someone who knows something about knitting. It's very obvious that there's no actual knitting happening. You just have static stitches on two needles with static yarn, and they're just kind of being smashed close area. In my head, I had remembered it as if actual stitches were moving from one needle to the other one and the yarn was being wrapped around, but when you rewatch it closely, it's just, you know, everything's static and they're just kind of like an animatronic. So yeah, the depiction of knitting was fun and very magical, but not really at all realistic. There's another very popular scene of Friends where they show Monica knitting, and I always wondered why 3 people were involved in the knitting. And you can see here that Monica does know what she's doing. She is once again knitting English styles. She's knitting directly from the skein though, which I have tried to do, but I always ended up with one gigantic mess of a knot of yarn. Again, I know this is just kind of like a plot device because it's funny that 3 people have to run together to get the door. It was really fun to look at some knitting scenes from TV shows, movies, commercials together. I hope that you enjoyed my reactions and slight commentary on all of them. I had quite a few more suggestions for knitting scenes to watch and react to that I didn't get to today, but if you have any more, please feel free to leave them down below in the comments if you want to see me react to a bit more knitting. What I would love to see is some Continental style knitting. I knit Continental, so I hold my yarn in my left hand and I pick with my needles rather than throw the yarn with my hands. So I'd love to see a little bit more Continental knitting represented. We did see a few examples where the people were clearly not actually knitting in the scenes, or the magic wasn't actually knitting the yarn on the needles. But at the end of the day, does it matter much? No. It just adds that little extra bit of joy when I do see that something is done correctly in a TV show or movie when it comes to knitting, crocheting, or any of the other fiber crafts that I know. I hope you enjoyed that, and if you enjoy things like this, again, please feel free to subscribe, and I will see you all again very, very soon. Bye!